The process of designing the Verusian uniform has spanned over 2 years, on and off, and I want to share the journey of designing it with you before showing you the present-day version, because it sure was a roller coaster. And also, if you stick around to the end, there will be a little nugget of lore I've written up with Stan, so let's get started. This first version was drawn when the world of Rust and Trenches was in a transitional period from focusing on creatures and monsters to involving humans too, and the war that started enveloping the project, which meant that Ram and Verus as countries were in their infancy. Their identity, let's say personality, was blurry at best. I had a bit of a better idea with Ram. I knew I wanted them to be self-sufficient and no nonsense, but for Verus, I had pretty much nothing besides having them contrast Ram. And that really shows in this version of this design because it is bad, because there was nothing to base the design on, a husk of a concept. Why hardened leather plate as armor? I don't know. Why is there a bird on the chest plate? Does it have any significance to Verus? No. None of the design parts have a reason to be there, and it doesn't even do a good job at contrasting Ram. So instead, I went and designed a different unit that I had a bit of a better idea of. A Verus mage. I wanted them to look fancy and have comfortable clothes, which isn't much to go off of, but it was better than nothing. I used medieval puffy pants to show it being comfortable and fancy, and also gave them curled shoes, a pointy hat, and robe, which I did to give them a wizardy vibe to sort of signify that they are a magic user. But all that ended up doing was leaning the design way too much into fantasy. Throughout the notes, you will see I draw this red scale that weighs fantasy against military. Fantasy means any elements that are based on medieval references or any sort of references that make it seem like typical fantasy design. And military is any elements that are based on military references of any era. I don't stick to any specific time periods, or I don't really know what time most things come from. And for my world's aesthetic, I want to strike a balance between fantasy and military, especially for the designs associated with the war. I don't want them leaning one way or the other. So, the scales are there to show you how much I think it's leaning. I also tried to give the design a codpiece, but didn't succeed. It looked too silly. For some reason, I didn't go with the version of the hat that I liked more and ended up drawing the worst iteration of the hat. And I had some interesting ideas with magic-formed armor that could be interesting to revisit in the future, but in the end, the design of this Verus mage was way too fantasy. But I did like some bits, the pointy hat in some sketches, and the idea of using puffy clothes, and this hood thing will all come back to influence the soldier's design later. After this design, my idea of Verus did develop a little further. I knew I wanted them to be fancier and more ornate than Ram, and I did think of religion for them as well, which had them worshipping a giant dead worm that brought about life. So I wanted to somehow work that into the design. And I also actually used references this time, which helped a lot. You can see I kept the puffy pants idea, and I showed Verus being fancier by having their armor have more segments. You can see hints of the pointy hat returning, but only faintly, as I didn't really know how extreme to go with it. And this dotted line pattern on the shirt was really interesting. I found a reference that had it, and it really helped pull things back into fantasy. And the way that I found to show the giant worm religion is by having braided rope as decorations. Also, I was having this issue with the transition from puffy pants to socks being too abrupt, so I tinkered with adding a second smaller puff around the knee, which did give the right shape, but again, it pulled it too far into fantasy this time, so I later changed out the second puff to knee wraps, which still gives the same shape but keeps the balance. And here you go, version 2 of the Verus soldier. For the time, I would say it did a lot of things well. It kept the fantasy and military balance really well. I think the puffy pants, knee wrap into sock transition really works, but there are clear flaws too. For one, why didn't I use the cool swoopy pointy hat? I was a coward. The dotted lines on the shirt could have been a different color, like red, and the patterns, or well, lack of patterns, which is because I didn't know what kind of patterns Verus would use. What would they have even taken inspiration from? The only thing I could go off of was the worm god, and the most I could get is some squiggly lines on the chest plate. And that makes it not look decorated enough to hit the fancy mark I wanted for Verus. But either way, this design did keep me happy for a bit, until I drew the mage. And what even? I don't even know how I got it this horribly wrong. The balance is completely out of the window, weird military robe with tassels, and if I haven't been brave enough with the hat before, then I have become too brave with this one. It is way too far into the land of fantasy. And a flipped up collar? Who are you? The bad boy of the military platoon? The dotted lines on the sleeves try to save it, but don't. Just the contrast of military robe with super exaggerated fantasy hat breaks the scale, a complete failure of a design. And it was so bad that it left a bad taste in my mouth about version 2 as a whole. And here is where we start slipping down the slope of sanity. I wanted to redesign it again, so I decided to practice actual military uniforms first, and then drew version 3. And because the mage left such a bad impression, I basically threw out most of the things about version 2, without considering what parts of version 2 I liked or not, which in turn caused this. Yeah, we are going backwards. The balance is ruined again. It's just a straight up military top with no fantasy elements to balance it. I even removed the dotted lines, which I liked about version 2, because I thought if I abandoned everything about version 2, I'd get something better than it. So I even tried to reiterate on the puffy knee wrap sock transition by adding an extra step, which just, no, it didn't work. It makes the puff too pronounced and gives strong jester vibes, which isn't what I'm going for. With version 3 now, I thought, this can't be right. I like it even less. But surely, it can't be because I removed most of version 2's elements without considering what I liked, or because Verus as a country is still too underdeveloped to get any better design out of it, because I actually need to develop their tradition and culture to influence more interesting designs. No, surely I just have to keep redrawing it over and over again until it works itself out. So I went for it. I kept going in circles, now losing the knee wraps for some reason, and still trying to force the military top. Adding fantasy elements with the cut-off armpits and the dotted lines back in, maybe that'll help. Then removing them again, adding knee wraps again just in case. Maybe add 2 rows of buttons. What if we made the shirt a little bit shorter? Or added the goddamn jester legs back? Or removed them and the knee wraps again? In the end, I landed on this design. I finally felt like I had something. I didn't. I was coping, trying to convince myself I did something with all that sketching, not admitting that my stubbornness got the best of me and that I should have stepped back a long time ago. Looking back at it, the design I ended up with didn't have any redeeming qualities. I lost everything that I liked about version 2. The jester legs and weird military shirt with armpits cut out was a terrible combo. It looked like the top and bottom half were 2 completely different characters. But did this finally make me step back and rethink things? Of course not. I thought, well, okay, fine. Maybe the military top doesn't work because it offsets the balance too much. What can I do? Well, what I did with Rom was change the material to Gambeson. That fixed it for them. Sure, let's do that. But then it would look too much like Rom. Well, I guess we can puff out the sleeves and wrap the arms. And oh, instead of straight line patterns, what if we do cross patterns? Genius! Well, still, it looks a little too much like Rom. You know what? Just cut it a little bit shorter. There you go. Now it looks different from Rom. And I finally brought back some sort of covering hood and the chest plate from version 2. So here it is, version 4. It works. It got me out of the hole I was stuck in and was something I was happier with. But if you think about it, just adding Gambeson, same as Rom, and making design changes just for the purpose of not making it look like Rom is not good design. It was a band-aid fix that didn't address the root of the problem, and in the process, I do feel like I lost a part of Verus in the design. But it was good enough for now. It got me back into drawing scenes, and from that point onwards, I would use this design whenever I drew Verus soldiers. I eventually even started using the pointy hat, but here's the thing. The more I drew the design in different scenes and settings, and the more my idea of Verus developed, something didn't feel right. The band-aids started to come loose. It was clear this wasn't a design that represented Verus in any meaningful way. Basing the design off of a weak reason like, I made it look like this so that it doesn't look too much like the other faction, is not good enough. And now, instead of just being an opposing force to Ram, the idea of Verus in my mind has had time to develop into a country that is driven by trade and self-image. Their religion and patterns are inspired by the world pillars and the other countries they trade with. Their traditions are riddled with needlessly complicated and convoluted rituals and customs, doing things for the sake of flaunting their wealth, and clothes that have details that have long lost their functions or were just added for the aesthetics. But Verus didn't get to its heights just by boasting. They earned it. Unmatched craftsmanship in tailoring, metal and jewelry work, and all other fields was what got them to the point of being this far up their own ass. And now that I know that about Verus, I feel like it's finally time to take off the band-aid and properly tend to the wound. First, what I did was properly look through my old versions of the uniform and look for things that I liked, which I somehow neglected to do with version 3 and 4. The pointy helmet, the hood, the puffy pants knee wrap sock transition, the dotted lines on the shirt, the high collar, and the decorative knots. And then I pulled together other random references that felt right. This one was my favorite. This helped me figure out the issue I was stuck with not being able to strike a balance on the shirt. I've only tried slapping fantasy bits onto a military uniform, but not the other way around, and that really was the key to getting it to feel right. So I used this as inspiration for the shape, and then added military things to it, like the buttoned cuffs and decorative knots and these shoulder loop things, and also added the dotted line texture with red string this time. Also, the socks have been changed to these things, which go around and wrap under the shoes instead. I like them a lot, and it doesn't change the overall silhouette. I also changed the puffy pants to be tie puffy pants instead, because another change since the previous design is that the religion of Verus changed to them worshipping the pillars and the pillarmen, which both are inspired by Thai art. Which also meant I could finally go ham and add lots of patterns onto their armor. And now I finally had a large base of ideas to take inspiration from for the patterns, because the pantheon of gods is also slowly getting filled out. In this case, the helm has the god of war on the side, which I haven't fully designed, but with the excuse of there being plenty of variation in how people depict the gods, there isn't a unified image of the god of war. Details differ depending on who illustrated it, so it's fine. And the chest plate just has a pillar in the middle with two pillarmen looking up at it, which is mostly covered by straps, sadly. Also, the armor's patterns are hammered straight into the metal, again showing their fine craftsmanship. And in the end, I did manage to squeeze in something that sort of resembles the silhouette of a codpiece. This same reference had this plume of cloth in front of the pants, which I really liked, and it does kind of give the same visual language as a codpiece. Success! Also, because this is only the average soldier, the visuals showing the over-the-top decorated nature of Verus still show but are more subtle compared to more important units like the mages, which will have a lot more over-the-top decorative details. But even so, this being the average soldier gives me a wonderful base to compare other designs to make them stand out more or less. That is pretty much everything I have to say about the newest design. I am really happy with how it turned out, and I finally feel like this properly represents Verus in its current state. Though that doesn't mean I don't have things that I still want to work on. The pouches, for example, I'm not happy with. I'll have to do some more research into more interesting types of pouches and such to just make them look, well, more interesting. And also I want the straps that cross the chest plate to have some sort of metal pieces on them, which I haven't found a way to nicely add. And for the segmented skirt armor, I haven't found a pattern to nicely put there yet. But those are just nitpicks, and compared to the previous versions of the designs, I feel like this one is the best out of the bunch. Now, just to finish this video off with a nice little treat, I wrote some lore, with the help of Stan, my writer, linked to his socials in the description below, including Shabby and Sedeka's socials as well, which are the other two people that helped me with this work. The story is about the rats, who are scavengers that the stranger accompanied to learn more about the war in the trenches, which I know doesn't have much to do with the Verusian soldiers, but I felt like writing it, and I'd say any lore is good lore anyway, so here you go. The tunnels were crude and incredibly narrow. Red roots and scrape marks lined the walls, each passage barely large enough for me to crawl through. But the rats made easy work of navigating them. When we finally arrived at a hatch, tiny glimpses of light trickled through the edges. The rats shifted in the narrow tunnel, making themselves comfortable, as suddenly muffled shouting and running could be heard from the outside, soon followed by gunfire and sudden explosions, shaking the tunnel and covering us in a thin layer of dirt. But all the rats just sat and waited, some picking their nails and others eagerly listening. An hour we waited, maybe two, but once the rifles fell silent and mud sloshed no more, the rats held themselves for but a minute, allowing the dust to settle before opening the hatch. The light was blinding, but as soon as my eyes adjusted, I stumbled into a trench filled with the bodies of Verusian soldiers, some clutching their chests, others face down, and some still twitching, but they made quick work of those. I watched as dozens of rats poured from the walls, their hatches perfectly hidden until pushed from the dirt, and all of them rushed for the bodies, efficiently and meticulously searching and picking them apart. Not one of them fought over the loot, all seemingly having their role, pointing and guiding each other in a hurry, first taking their tags, searching their pouches, then taking off the belts and straps. Other rats took the guns and helms before scurrying back into their holes, then turning them over, searching their backpacks or entirely cutting them off and taking those too. They were about to start taking the chest plates off of the soldiers when one of the rats, on lookout from a higher up ridge, made a chirp that sent the rest of the rats scrambling to finish up their scavenging. While many retreated right away, a few rats worked to prop their bodies up against the side of the trench, rows of hands neatly folded in their laps and heads turned upwards to the sky, perhaps as a strange gesture to pay respect. I climbed back in, almost pushed aside as the rest clambered their way in and pulled the hatch shut. Not even a moment after, the sound of boots in mud could be heard from outside. Most of the rats have already crawled back deeper into the tunnel, but some stayed behind with me, shushing each other with giddy grins, seemingly enjoying how cheeky they have been. As I sat there, hearing the muffled conversations of soldiers outside, stumbling upon their work, still baffled by what I witnessed, I started to ask myself questions. How did the rats know there was a firefight breaking out? I know rats are occasionally hired as guides by Ram and Verus. Did they orchestrate this? Or did one of the rats just hear some commotion and notify the others? Either way, I was impressed by their efficiency. I was expecting a swarm of them frantically fighting over the bodies as their name would imply, but no, there certainly is more to these rats than the rumors say. Well, there you go. I hope you enjoyed that. This was a bit of a longer video, so tell me what you think about it in the comments, and also thank you to all of my patrons for, as always, making this possible. And if you would like to support me on Patreon as well, that will also be in the description below. Take care, and see you in the next one. Success!
Yes! Codpiece, let's go! Let's go, Codpiece! Woo! Codpiece! Yeah, baby! Codpiece!
Oh, God. Okay. Also...
Whoa! Codpiece! Yeah! I can't believe it! It's a codpiece!
Also because this is only... Shut up.